it proves that, well, if nothing else, Mr. Speaker, it proves the power of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, key A&E waiting target have not been met since 2015. NHS managers are saying they won't be met till 2019, and February was the worst ever month for accident and emergency performances. NHS Providers Director Saffron Cordery said, "This is the first time we've had to accept the NHS will not meet its key constitutional standards. If we want to provide quality of care, we need the right long-term financial settlement." The NHS is clearly in crisis. So why wasn't there a penny extra for the NHS in yesterday's statement by the Chancellor?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, we didn't wait until yesterday's spring statement to announce more money for the NHS. We announced it in the budget last autumn. And as a result of that, the NHS is getting £2.5 billion more in the forthcoming financial year 18-19 and more to fund the nurses' pay settlement when that is resolved.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, under Labour, the 18-week target for non-urgent operations was in place. The target has also been abandoned by the Prime Minister. When will that be reinstated?
Prime Minister.
Well, the right honourable gentleman talks about under Labour things that were being delivered. Perhaps he might look to see what Labour are doing in Wales in their delivery on the latest annual data. The latest annual data shows, when we're looking at 12-hour waits in A&E, that 3.4% of patients waited over 12 hours in Wales compared to 1.3% in England. If he wants to talk about meeting targets, he should talk to the Labour government in Wales.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, NHS England abandoned its A&E targets until April 2019. It's a bit rich for the Prime Minister to be scaremongering about Wales while she's abandoned the targets in England. Mr. Speaker, a recent...
Order. Lots of questions to get through and they must be heard. Jeremy Corbyn.
A recent NAO report states that NHS funding will fall by 0.3% in 2019. People's lives are at stake. Is the Prime Minister really saying A&E doctors are wrong, NHS managers are wrong, Royal Colleges are wrong, health unions are wrong, and actually it's only she that knows best about the NHS?
Prime Minister.
Can I just point out to the right honourable gentleman, he talks about scaremongering in Wales. I was pointing out the facts about what is happening in the NHS in Wales. And that's why we do see that's why we do see people in Wales often trying actually to get treatment in England rather than in Wales. But can I also say to the right honourable gentleman, we are putting more money into the National Health Service. We are putting more money into the National Health Service. But what you need in order to be able to do that is to ensure that you have a strong economy to provide the money for the National Health Service. What do we know about the Labour's policies? It would cause a run on the pound, crash our economy, bankrupt Britain, and there'd be less money for the NHS.
Jeremy Corbyn.
When people are dying because of overcrowding and long waits in our hospitals, I think the Prime Minister should get a grip on it and ensure the NHS now has the money that it needs to deal with the patient demands. In a recent interview, the Health Secretary said of NHS staff, when they signed up to go into medicine, they knew there would be pressurised moments. What they also expected was a recognition, an annual pay rise without cuts in paid leave, proper funding for the National Health Service. And when there are 100,000 unfilled posts, clearly not enough staff around them to share the burden. We started with Professor Stephen Hawking, and he said just a few months ago, there is overwhelming evidence that NHS funding and the number of doctors and nurses are inadequate, and it's getting worse. Does she agree with Professor Hawking?
Prime Minister.
Once again, once again, I'm very happy to point out some facts to the right honourable gentleman. We have 14,900 more doctors working in the National Health Service. We have almost 13,900 more nurses working on our wards. Why did we put an emphasis on nurses working in our wards? Because of what we saw under the Labour government in mid-Staffordshire. And I just say to the right honourable gentleman this, that what we need to do to ensure that we can provide the funding for the NHS, and we are providing record levels of funding for the NHS, is to ensure that we take a balanced approach to our economy. That's an approach to our economy that deals with our debts, keeps taxes low on working families, and puts more money into our public services like hospitals and schools. Labour's approach would increase the debt. Labour's approach would mean less money for our schools and hospitals, and it would mean higher taxes for ordinary working people, because what we know about the Labour Party is it's always ordinary people who pay the price of Labour.
Last week's launch of a consultation on all aspects of domestic violence will be widely welcomed in Gloucester and across the country. So will the Prime Minister, who has done so much on these issues, confirm today that the government intends to increase spending, bed provision and, where necessary, women's refuges, so that those who have survived get the help and safe haven that they deserve?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend has raised a very important issue, and this is an issue which I have not only obviously given considerable attention to, but my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, continues to follow that. It's a very important point. We are entirely committed to developing a sustainable funding model for refugees. I can guarantee that funding for refugees will continue at the same level as today, because I know how critical this support is to the vulnerable people at a time of crisis. And we will ring-fence the funding for short-term supported housing overall, including refugees, for the long term indefinitely. That means no refuge should worry about closing or have any doubts about our commitments to ensure that we provide a sustainable funding model for them.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party as far as hate crime and Islamophobia, and of course thoughts are with the family and friends of Dr. Stephen Hawking. Mr. Speaker, for months the devolved administrations have been waiting for the UK Government to table amendments to Clause 11. On Monday, these long-awaited amendments were published, but without the agreement of the devolved governments. Can the Prime Minister tell the House why these amendments have been forced on the devolved administrations?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, in one sentence he says he was waiting for this amendment, and the reason that we were taking time was because we were talking with the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, and then we do publish, he complains that we've published it. He really needs to get his story straight.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage the Prime Minister to listen to the question, because it was about agreement, and I'm afraid that answer simply wasn't good enough. The Prime Minister famously claimed that the UK was made up of equal partners. What an irony, now that she's overseeing the demolition of the devolution settlement. In 1997, the Tories were happy to oppose the re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament. Their clothes haven't changed. Now in 2018, they're happy to systematically destroy the settlement that the Parliament thrives on. I call upon the Prime Minister once again, stop this attack on devolution and redouble your efforts in working with the devolved administrations in finding agreements.
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman. This is a government that has actually given more powers to the Scottish Government. This is a government that will be giving more powers to the Scottish Government. Significant extra powers will be devolved to the Scottish and Welsh Governments as a result of the decisions that we're taking around Brexit. But we have given more powers, including, of course, the tax-raising powers. It's just a pity that the Scottish nationalists have chosen to use their tax-raising powers to increase the taxes on people earning £26,000 or more.
Jeremy Quinn.
Horsham last week held an apprenticeship fair, building on the success which since 2010 has seen a 70% reduction in youth unemployment. Nationally, we see increasing exports increasing productivity, increasing real wages. Will my right honourable friend again remind the House that it's that sustained economic performance that underpins our investment in our valued public services?
Prime Minister.
Can I commend Horsham for holding an apprenticeship fair? I think it's very important that we give young people the opportunity for those apprenticeships, but my honourable friend is absolutely right. We can only fund those public services if we have the strength in our economy providing the income for us to be able to do that. And in the last few weeks we've seen manufacturing output which has now grown for 9 consecutive months. That's the first time since records began in 1968. We've seen the best 2 quarters of productivity growth since the financial crisis and the lowest year-to-date net borrowing since 2008, and of course employment near a record high. That's what Conservatives are doing, delivering a strong economy, new jobs, healthier finances, an economy that really is fit for the future.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, last week GKN workers came to Parliament, typically 25 and 30 years service. Their mums and dads before them working for a British engineering icon 259 years old. Sat opposite were the 3 fabulously wealthy owners of Melrose, determined to stage a hostile takeover of their company, break it up and sell it off. Can I ask the Prime Minister this? She told Parliament she would act in the national interest. The next 10 days will decide the future. Will she use the powers that she has to intervene to block this hostile takeover in the British national interest?
To the honourable gentleman, as he knows, the Business Secretary has been speaking to both of these companies on an impartial basis. We will always act in the UK national interest. Actually, it's under this government that we've seen the changes introduced to the Takeover Code to provide greater transparency, to give target firms more time to respond. There are a narrow range of scenarios where ministers can intervene on mergers on public interest grounds, but we will always ensure that we act in the national interest.
Andrew Salou.
3,157 medical students are going into general practice this year, which is excellent news. But we are still losing too many experienced GPs in their mid-50s due to the tax penalties on their old pension scheme. Would the government look at a targeted, time-limited exemption on this dedicated group of clinicians who do so much for the health of us all?
Prime Minister.
I say to my honourable friend, this is an important point. As he will know, experienced senior hospital doctors and GPs who become a member of the National Health Service pension scheme benefit from one of the best available defined benefit occupational pension schemes. And we provide generous tax reliefs to allow everyone to build up a pension pot worth just over £1 million tax-free. But the issue that he's raising is that GPs are not penalised if they work after age 55, but many may have exhausted the generous allowance for tax relief that is available by that time. But I can say to my honourable friend that the Chancellor of the Exchequer was, of course, listening to the question that he raised.
Mr. Virendra Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 13th of April this year represents the 99th anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, in India, known as Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, in which more than 1,000 peaceful protesters were murdered by soldiers under the command of General Dyer. Will the Prime Minister join me in commemorating the massacre and meet with me and others campaigning for this shameful episode to be remembered across the UK?
Prime Minister.
The honourable gentleman has raised a very specific issue and a very specific point, and I will be happy to look at the question that he's raised with me and respond to him in writing.
Leo Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, Farnborough, in the borough of Rushmore, is the birthplace of British aviation and now home to a thriving range of aviation, aerospace and defence businesses, including the Airbus Zephyr. Will my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, join me in extending our best wishes to the Zephyr team as they look forward to making a world record-breaking attempt for high-altitude unmanned aviation.
Prime Minister.
I'm very happy to join with my honourable friend in wishing all the very best to the Zephyr team in the attempt that they are making. But he's right that his constituency plays a very crucial role in the aerospace industry, and I'm pleased to say that we're continuing to work with that industry through the Aerospace Growth Partnership to ensure that we can further enhance that industry, and we wish the Zephyr team well.
Bill Esterson.
Mr. Speaker, the UK has the lowest growth in the G7. So why is the government's answer to this to give handouts to some of the wealthiest bankers to fund an already lavish lifestyle, paid for by taking the crumbs off the table of those on universal credit whose children depend on free school meals?
Prime Minister.
First of all, the honourable gentleman might not have noticed that the wealthiest 1% of people in this country are now paying the biggest share of tax, 28%, than they ever did under a Labour government. But if he's referring to the bank levy, can I also say to him, it was the Conservative Party that introduced the bank levy that has raised £15 billion and is predicted to raise a further £11 billion that we can spend on public services. It is the Conservative government that is changing the way we do it, so we do it in a better way. So in future, we will be raising nearly £19 billion extra from the banks over the next 5 years. That's £3 billion more money from the banks to be spent on public services.
Neil Parish.
Great British food is produced by hard-working farming families in this country. As we produce a new British agricultural policy, does my right honourable friend agree with me that supporting food production in this country is a public good?
Prime Minister.
Very happy to agree with my honourable friend the importance of food production in this country. I'm also happy to commend the work of hard-working farmers up and down the country, but also all those who work in our food production industry. And we now have, as my honourable friend will know, a historic opportunity as we leave the EU to deliver a farming policy that is going to work for the whole industry.
Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just minutes ago, Facebook announced that they will be taking down several pages associated with the extremist group Britain First. Does the Prime Minister join me in welcoming that? But does she not also accept that there needs to be a clear role provided by government to give guidance to social media companies on how they operate in our democracy?
Prime Minister.
I certainly welcome that announcement by Facebook, and I'm pleased to say that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has been working with these companies to ensure that they do more, they do act more clearly in taking down material that is of an extremist nature. But I'm very pleased to welcome the announcement that Facebook has made, and I hope other companies will follow.
Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I first congratulate the Prime Minister on her pioneering work in fighting modern-day slavery. However, has she been advised that a central plank of her law enforcement policy isn't working? With 65 prosecutions of traffickers abandoned last year because of victim fear as to their safety, and no reparations orders to compensate victims for the ordeals made against convicted traffickers.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for raising what is a very important issue. In fact, at the meeting that I chaired recently, in a matter of 2 weeks ago, I think it was, of the Modern Slavery Task Force that I have brought together to bring people from across government, but also from law enforcement, from the judiciary, from criminal justice more generally, and from others, to look at how we're working with this. We were addressing exactly this issue of prosecutions and how can we can ensure that more prosecutions go ahead in future and perpetrators are brought to justice.
Vernon Coker.
Shockingly, in this country, in 2017, there were 2,120 children who were identified as being possible potential victims of child slavery. I know the Prime Minister's personal commitment to tackling this issue, but surely we ought to have more data. We have no idea how many of those children go missing. We have no idea how many are deported, and we have no idea how many are re-trafficked. In this country, in 2018, a modern democracy, that is simply not good enough. Can the Prime Minister tell us what she's going to do about that?
The honourable gentleman has raised a very important issue, and it has been a concern for a long time, where children are identified as the victims of slavery, the victims of human trafficking, and when sometimes we do see them, sadly, being in a position where they are then able to be taken out by traffickers and resubmitted to the horrible circumstances that brings to them. We don't return, just on the point that he's making about asylum and deportation, we don't return unaccompanied children who don't qualify for asylum or humanitarian protection unless we can confirm that there are safe and adequate reception programmes and arrangements in place in their home country. And if we can't confirm such arrangements, we grant temporary leave up until the child is 17 and a half. And last October 2017, we confirmed our commitment to roll out independent child trafficking advocates across the country. This is a system that we piloted previously, which will give support to those child victims to ensure that they are given the support they need and that they don't fall back into the hands of traffickers.
Lucy Allen.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Like many towns and cities across the country, Telford has had some experiences of distressing cases of child sexual exploitation. The authorities in Telford have now agreed to conduct an independent inquiry to find out what happened and to give victims answers. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating two brave women, campaigner Holly Archer and Sunday Mirror journalist Geraldine McKelvey, for their work in bringing this about? And will she agree to do everything possible to ensure this inquiry starts without delay and leaves no stone unturned?
Prime Minister.
I say to my honourable friend, I think we have all been shocked by the horrific case that we have seen in Telford of some of the most vulnerable in our country being preyed upon by ruthless criminals. Sadly, of course, this is not the first example that we have seen taking place across our country. I'm very happy to join my honourable friend in congratulating Holly and Geraldine for the work that they have done. This is not easy, but it's right that they have brought this to light and that action can be taken. I'm pleased that the authorities are now going to conduct an inquiry. It is, as my honourable friend says, important that it begins its work in order to get to the truth and does that as quickly as possible. And I understand that my honourable friend will be meeting my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Under Secretary for Crime, Safeguarding and Vulnerability, to discuss this issue.
Joe Platt.
Shortly after the Prime Minister took office, she said that she wanted to put the government on the side of the poorest in society. She even stood in front of a crumbling sign that said she wanted a country that works for everyone. But with a recent IFS report stating that 37% of children are set to live in poverty by 2022, what went wrong, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
We have seen 200,000 fewer children living in absolute poverty in this country under this government. We continue to take action to ensure that we are helping families to get a regular income by helping people into work, that we're ensuring that the lowest paid in our society get that pay increase through increasing the national living wage, and ensuring that we help people with the standard of living by cutting the taxes for 31 million people.
Sir David Amis.
Is my right honourable friend aware that the inspirational Music Man project in Southend that works with people who have learning difficulties has now set a world record for tinkling the most number of triangles ever? Does my right honourable friend agree with me that that is yet another reason why Southend should be made a city? And will she please now organise a contest with our honourable friend so that Southend-on-Sea becomes the first post-Brexit city?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend, I'm very happy to congratulate the Music Man project in Southend for the record that they have achieved in tinkling triangles. I'm sure that my honourable friend has heard his bid for Southend to become a city. I have to say to my honourable friend that, of course, there will be a number of members of this House who will be putting forward their own towns for that accolade in due course. I knew a city had to have a cathedral. I didn't know it had to have tinkling triangles, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister will be aware that this week the notorious rapist John Warboys was released from high security prison. One of my constituents who gave evidence at his trial as a victim wants to know why he was not tested first in open prison conditions, and why the parole board is not required to publish the reasoning behind its release decisions, including evidence of contrition.
Well, can I, first of all, as the Right Honourable Gentleman will know, there is a case before the courts at the moment, and I understand as part of that case the parole board will be required to explain the reasons why they took the decision. But in terms of the overall issue of parole board decisions and transparency of that, when this decision became clear, my Right Honourable friend, the then Justice Secretary, now the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, called for work to be done, which has been continued under the current Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, to look at this whole question of parole board decisions and the transparency around them.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. I am immensely proud to have the world-leading research and teaching hospital of Addenbrooke's in my constituency of South Cambridgeshire. Their scale and excellence means they rely heavily on doctors from overseas. But of late, they've struggled to bring some of those doctors in because of restrictions on the Tier 2 visa numbers. And with applications reducing from the EU too, it's becoming a real problem. Please can the Prime Minister reassure me and my hospital that she's aware of this challenge and she has a plan to address it?
Well, can I
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend, I am aware of that particular issue. Of course, in the longer term, one of the things that we are doing is to ensure that we can train more doctors here in the United Kingdom. But I'm aware of the issue that she has raised, and I will look into it.
Laura Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the Prime Minister acknowledged that our social care system is broken and promised to fix it. Since then, 2 care providers in Crewe and Nantwich have been placed into special measures, and another is worried that it may have to close due to a lack of funding. What does the Prime Minister say to providers who state the local government settlement doesn't go far enough and that they cannot afford to wait for the government's green paper?
Minister.
Well, I say to the honourable lady that, as she will know, I have always said that there were some short-term measures that needed to be taken in relation to the pressure on social care, medium-term measures and long-term. In the short term, we have provided more funding for local authorities. £2 billion extra was announced by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We are seeing more money going into social care in local authorities. We, in the medium term, need to ensure that best practice is spread across the whole country. And we also do, as she's referred to the Green Paper, need to ensure that we can develop a long-term sustainable funding model for social care in this country, and that's what we continue to work on.
Speaker. It is sadly a matter of public record that RBS and HBOS deliberately asset stripped thousands of potentially viable businesses to benefit their own bank or individual bankers. And evidence before the High Court indicates that Lloyds may also be guilty of the same. Would the Prime Minister consider the calls of the all-party group for fair business banking, which has been endorsed by the Chief Executive of the FCA, Andrew Bailey, for a full public inquiry into this disgraceful scandal?
Minister.
This is an issue that is of concern to many. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy, and we need to ensure that we do learn the lessons that, from what happened at RBS and HBOS. And as he will know, the FCA has reported areas of widespread inappropriate treatment of firms by RBS, who have apologised and set up a scheme for compensation for victims. There is an ongoing investigation which is continuing to be conducted by the FCA into RBS, and they're also undertaking 2 separate investigations into HBOS. But we will continue to work with the independent regulator and the industry to ensure that small and medium-sized businesses get the support they need.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just since Christmas, there have been 5 high-profile gun crimes in Haringey, including one last Thursday when a 19-year-old young man named Kelvin Odunyi was shot in the head with the marksman a pillion on the back of a moped to the entrance of a cinema in Wood Green. We know our streets are plagued by knife crime. Now the intent to kill with a gun takes the epidemic to a whole new level. This can't go on and it must stop. Will the Prime Minister please meet with me and community leaders to put an end to this epidemic of gun crime?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the honourable lady that I suggest that she meets with the Home Secretary, who will shortly be publishing a strategy in relation to this issue of serious violence that takes place. We're all concerned about the use of mopeds has been known for snatching, for effectively mugging, and that's something that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, had already been working and working on with the police, but on this issue that she's raised of gun crime, I'm sure my right honourable friend will be happy to meet her.
Mr Peter Bone. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following the question from the right honourable member for Gedling, could I agree entirely with what he said? The Prime Minister has done more than anyone in this House to end the terrible modern-day slavery. But we have one problem, sir, and that is the treatment of child victims. They are put in the care of local authorities, and as the honourable member said, they are then re-trafficked. Could we look at having a system like we do for adults, where safe homes are provided centrally, not by local government, so re-trafficking cannot occur?
Prime Minister.
Yes, well, my honourable friend follows up the right honourable member for Gedling on an important point about these child victims of trafficking, and I will certainly look at the issue that he has raised. The independent child advocates that I referred to in my response to the right honourable member for Gedling was one way in which we feel we can give greater support to these child victims to ensure that we do not see them being lost to the local authorities and being re-trafficked, because he's absolutely right. It is a scandal when a victim goes into the care of a local authority and then somebody is able to come along and remove them from that care and take them back into slavery.
Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the response of the Russian government to the incident in Salisbury. First, on behalf of the whole House, let me pay tribute once again to the bravery and professionalism of all the emergency services, doctors, nurses and investigation teams who have led the response to this appalling incident. And also to the fortitude of the people of Salisbury. And let me reassure them that, as Public Health England have made clear, the ongoing risk to public health is low, and the government will continue to do everything possible to support this historic city to recover fully. Mr. Speaker, on Monday I set out that Mr. Scripal and his daughter were poisoned with a Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent developed by Russia. Based on this capability, combined with their record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, including against former intelligence officers whom they regard as legitimate targets, the UK government concluded that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for this reckless and despicable act. And there were only two plausible explanations. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or conceivably the Russian government could have lost control of a military-grade nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others. Mr. Speaker, it was right to offer Russia the opportunity to provide an explanation, but their response has demonstrated complete disdain for the gravity of these events. They have provided no credible explanation that could suggest they lost control of their nerve agent. No explanation as to how this agent came to be used in the United Kingdom. No explanation as to why Russia has an undeclared chemical weapons programme in contravention of international law. Instead, they have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Scripal and his daughter, and for threatening the lives of other British citizens in Salisbury, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And as I set out on Monday, it has taken place against the backdrop of a well-established pattern of Russian state aggression across Europe and beyond. It must therefore be met with a full and robust response, beyond the actions we have already taken since the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, and to counter this pattern of Russian aggression elsewhere. As the discussion in this House on Monday made clear, it is essential that we now come together with our allies to defend our security, to stand up for our values, and to send a clear message to those who would seek to undermine them. This morning I chaired a further meeting of the National Security Council, where we agreed immediate actions to dismantle the Russian espionage network in the UK, urgent work to develop new powers to tackle all forms of hostile state activity, and to ensure that those seeking to carry out such activity cannot enter the UK, and additional steps to suspend all planned high-level contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. Let me start with the immediate actions. Mr. Speaker, the House will recall that following the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, the UK expelled 4 diplomats. Under the Vienna Convention, the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion for over 30 years, and it reflects the fact that this is not the first time that the Russian state has acted against our country. Through these expulsions, we will fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come, and if they seek to rebuild it, we will prevent them from doing so. Second, we will urgently develop proposals for new legislative powers to harden our defences against all forms of hostile state activity. This will include the addition of a targeted power to detain those suspected of hostile state activity at the UK border. This power is currently only permitted in relation to those suspected of terrorism. And I have asked the Home Secretary to consider whether there is a need for new counter-espionage powers to clamp down on the full spectrum of hostile activities of foreign agents in our country. Mr. Speaker, as I set out on Monday, we will also table a government amendment to the sanctions bill to strengthen our powers to impose sanctions in response to the violation of human rights. In doing so, we will play our part in an international effort to punish those responsible for the sorts of abuses suffered by Sergei Magnitsky. And I hope, as with all the measures I am setting out today, that this will command cross-party support. Mr. Speaker, we will also make full use of existing powers to enhance our efforts to monitor and track the intentions of those travelling to the UK who could be engaged in activity that threatens the security of the UK and of our. So we will increase checks on private customs and freight. We will freeze Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life or property of UK nationals or residents. And led by the National Crime Agency, we will continue to bring all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites. There is no place for these people or their money in our country. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. While our response must be robust, it must also remain true to our values as a liberal democracy that believes in the rule of law. Many Russians have made this country their home, abide by our laws, and make an important contribution to our country, which we must continue to welcome. But to those who seek to do us harm, my message is simple. You are not welcome here. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to our bilateral relationship. As I said on Monday, we have had a very simple approach to Russia: engage but beware. And I continue to believe it is not in our national interest to break off all dialogue between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. But in the aftermath of this appalling act against our country, this relationship cannot be the same. So we will suspend all planned high-level bilateral contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. This includes revoking the invitation to Foreign Minister Lavrov to pay a reciprocal visit to the UK and confirming there will be no attendance by ministers or indeed members of the royal family at this summer's World Cup in Russia. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we will deploy a range of tools from across the full breadth of our national security apparatus in order to counter the threats of hostile state activity. While I have set out some of these measures today, members on all sides will understand that there are some that cannot be shared publicly for reasons of national security. And of course, there are other measures we stand ready to deploy at any time should we face further Russian provocation. Mr. Speaker, none of the actions we take are intended to damage legitimate activity or prevent contacts between our populations. We have no disagreement with the people of Russia, who have been responsible for so many great achievements throughout their history. Many of us looked at a post-Soviet Russia with hope. We wanted a better relationship, and it is tragic that President Putin has chosen to act in this way. But we will not tolerate the threat to life of British people and others on British soil from the Russian government, nor will we tolerate such a flagrant breach of Russia's international obligations. Mr. Speaker, as I set out on Monday, The United Kingdom does not stand alone in confronting Russian aggression. In the last 24 hours, I have spoken to President Trump, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron. We have agreed to cooperate closely in responding to this barbaric act and to coordinate our efforts to stand up for the rules-based international order which Russia seeks to undermine. I will also speak to other allies and partners in the coming days. And I welcome the strong expressions of support from NATO and from partners across the European Union and beyond. Later today in New York, the UN Security Council will hold open consultations where we will be pushing for a robust international response. We have also notified the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons about Russia's use of this nerve agent, and we are working with the police to enable the OPCW to independently verify our analysis. Mr. Speaker, this was not just an act of attempted murder in Salisbury, nor just an act against the UK. It is an affront to the prohibition on the use of chemical weapons, and it is an affront to the rules-based system on which we and our international partners depend. We will work with our allies and partners to confront such actions wherever they threaten our security, at home and abroad. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement and echo absolutely her words about the service of our emergency and public services. The attack in Salisbury was an appalling act of violence. Nerve agents are abominable if used in any war. It is utterly reckless to use them in a civilian environment. This attack in Britain has concerned our allies in the European Union, NATO and the UN, and their words of solidarity have strengthened our position diplomatically. Our response as a country must be guided by the rule of law, support for international agreements and respect for human rights. So when it comes to the use of chemical weapons on British soil, it is essential that the government works with the United Nations to strengthen its chemical weapons monitoring system and involves the Office of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The Prime Minister said on Monday, either this was a direct act by the Russian state or the Russian government lost control of their potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get in the hands of others. Our response must be both decisive and proportionate and based on clear evidence. If the government believes that it is still a possibility that Russia negligently lost control of a military-grade nerve agent, what action is being taken through the OPCW with our allies? I welcome the fact the police are working with the OPCW. And has the Prime Minister taken the necessary steps under the Chemical Weapons Convention to make a formal request for evidence from the Russian government under Article 9.2? How has she responded to the Russian government's request for a sample of the agent used in the Salisbury attack to run its own tests? Has high-resolution trace analysis been run on a sample of the nerve agent, and has that revealed any evidence as to the location of its production or the identity of its perpetrators? And can the Prime Minister update the House on what conversations, if any, she has had with the Russian government? And while suspending planned high-level contacts, does the Prime Minister agree that it is essential to maintain a robust dialogue with Russia in the interest of our own and wider international security? With many countries, Mr. Speaker, speaking out alongside us, the circumstances demand that we build an international consensus to address the use of chemical weapons. We should urge our international allies to join us and call on Russia to reveal without delay full details of its chemical weapons programme to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It is, as we on these benches have expressed before, a matter of huge regret
that our country's diplomatic capacity has been stripped back with cuts of 25% in the last 5 years. It is, Mr. Speaker,
the right honourable gentleman must be heard. There will be adequate opportunity for colleagues on both sides of the House to put questions. Members must be heard. Jeremy Corbyn.
I couldn't understand a word of what the Foreign Secretary just said, Mr. Speaker, but his behaviour demeans his office. It is in moments such as these that governments realise how vital strong diplomacy and political pressure are for our security and national interest. The measures we take have to be effective, not just for the long-term security of our citizens, but to secure a world free of chemical weapons. So can the Prime Minister outline what discussions she has had with our partners in the European Union, NATO and the UN, and what willingness there was to take multilateral action? While the poisonings, Mr. Speaker, of Sergei and Yulia Scripal are confronting us today, what efforts are being made by the government to reassess the death of Mr. Skripal's daughter, Lyudmila, who died in 2012, and the deaths of his eldest brother and son, who have both died in the past 2 years? We have a duty to speak out against the abuse of human rights by the Putin government and its supporters, both at home and abroad. And I join many others in this House in paying tribute to the many campaigners in Russia for human rights and justice and democracy in that country. And Mr. Speaker, we must do more to address the dangers posed by the state's relationship with unofficial mafia-like groups and corrupt oligarchs. We must also expose the flows of ill-gotten cash between the Russian state and billionaires who become stupendously rich by looting their country and subsequently use London to protect their wealth. We welcome the Prime Minister's statement today, clearly committing to support the Magnitsky amendments and implementing them as soon as possible, as we on this side have long pushed for. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Nikolai Glushkov, a Russian exile who was close friends with the late oligarch Boris Berezovsky, was found dead in his London home. What reassurance can she give to citizens of Russian origin living in Britain that they are safe here? Mr. Speaker, the events in Salisbury earlier this month are abominable and have been rightly condemned across the House. Britain has to build a consensus with our allies, and we support the Prime Minister in... Mr. Speaker, we support the Prime Minister in taking multilateral action and firm action to ensure we strengthen the Chemical Weapons Convention, to ensure that this dreadful, appalling act, which we totally condemn, never happens again in our country.
The right honourable gentleman raised a number of questions around the nerve agent that had been used. He asked if we were putting together an international coalition to call on Russia to reveal the details of its chemical weapons programme to the OPCW. That is indeed what we did. We gave the Russian government the opportunity, through the démarche that my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, delivered to the Russian ambassador here in London earlier this week, to do just that. They have not done so. He's raised a number of questions. He asked about the corrupt elites and money going through London. As I said in my statement, led by the National Crime Agency, we will continue to bring all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites. There is no place for these people or their money in our country, and that work is ongoing. He talked about getting an international consensus together. As I have said, I've spoken to Chancellor Merkel, to President Trump, to President Macron. Others have also expressed their support. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, said we stand in solidarity with our allies in the United Kingdom, and those responsible for both those who committed the crime and those who ordered it must face appropriately serious consequences. The NATO Council has expressed deep concern at the first offensive use of a nerve agent on alliance territory since NATO's foundation, and allies agreed the attack was a clear breach of international norms and agreements. And Donald Tusk, the President of the EU Council, said, I express my full solidarity with PM Theresa May in the face of the brutal attack, inspired most likely by Moscow. I'm ready to put the issue on next week's European Council. So we will be doing that. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, this is not a question of our diplomacy, of what diplomatic support we have around the world. This is a question of the culpability of the Russian state for an act on our soil. And he said that we should be trying to build a consensus. It's clear from the conversations I've had with allies that we have a consensus with our allies. It was clear from the remarks that were made by backbenchers across the whole of this House on Monday that there is a consensus across the backbenches of this House. I am only sorry that the consensus does not go as far as the right honourable gentleman have taken the opportunity, as the UK government has done, to condemn the culpability of the Russian state.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, it seems to me, without any access to closed information, that the choice of this particularly bizarre and dreadful way of killing an individual is a deliberate choice by the Russian government to put their signature on a particular killing, so that other defectors are left in no doubt that it is the Russian government that will act if they're disappointed in any way by their actions. Now, in the light of that, the only sensible question that the Leader of the Opposition asked was what consultation we propose to have with NATO, the other European countries, with the American government, about positive action that could be taken to prevent this continuing defiance of international law with the defiance of all the rules on testing and possession of chemical weapons. It's not just a question of expressing our anger about Salisbury. This is actually a serious threat to the safety of the Western world, unless and until we all do something together to actually start getting the Russians to do something, as opposed to simply ignore us.
Well said. My right honourable friend and learned friend is absolutely right, and that is why we are not only talking to allies bilaterally, but there will, as I understand it, be a meeting of the NATO Council tomorrow, at which this issue will be considered. As the President of the EU Council has said, he will be putting this on the agenda of the European Union Council meeting at the end of next week. And my right honourable and learned friend is absolutely right. While we rightly initially focus on the use of this nerve agent here in the UK and its impact on us here in the UK, this is about the illegal use of chemical weapons by the Russian state. And it is about an illegal programme to in developing those chemical weapons by the Russian state. And we will leave no stone unturned in order to work with our allies to ensure that we respond appropriately to that.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement. As the Prime Minister has stated, the attack on Mr. Scripal and his daughter was an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, there has to be a robust response to the use of terror on our streets. We must act in a measured way to show that we will simply not tolerate this behaviour. And in this regard, I welcome and associate with those of us in these benches with the measures contained in the statement. On this matter, I commit my party to working constructively with the government. I am sure the House will join me with extending thanks to the police and security services who are working round the clock on the recent case in Salisbury.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, it has been warming to see our closest friends and allies across Europe expressing solidarity and support. Our friends globally must join with us by standing up to this abuse of state power by Russia. And I look forward to discussions in the United Nations. The United Nations must speak with a clear and an unambiguous voice. Mr. Speaker, the fact that we are expelling the largest number of undeclared intelligence officers in over 30 years is welcome, and is the desire to examine what can be done from a legislative perspective to defend against hostile state activity. As someone who has previously supported the so-called Majinsky measures, I am pleased that the government is signalling action in this area. And let me commend the actions of Bill Bowder, who I've had the opportunity to meet previously, someone that has been personally at massive risk and has stood up to the effects of Russian state power. Mr. Speaker, financial sanctions are welcome, and we must redouble our efforts against any money laundering by those responsible. It must be clear to the Russian authorities that we will not tolerate activities that infringe international law. Whilst we support the PM's actions, we will continue to scrutinise them carefully, and we must ensure proper scrutiny of any new proposed legislation. Our thoughts are with those in Russia who have suffered from abuse of state power. There is no doubt that that is what we are seeing. And in doing so, we look forward to a time where we can engage positively for a time of peace and cooperation. But the only response today must be a robust one towards the Kremlin and to Russia.
Can I Mr. Speaker, can I once again thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for not just the tone of his response, but for the comments that he has made. Can I reassure him that, of course, any legislative proposals we bring forward will have due scrutiny in this House? Can I thank him for his constructive offer to work with the government on this issue, because it is a matter that should concern us across the whole House? And can I reassure him that, although I have made reference to a number of allies who have spoken in support of the United Kingdom in this, others have too. Canada, Australia, for example, have also been very clear that a robust response is appropriate to this. And once again, I welcome the comments made by the Right Honourable Gentleman.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I commend my right honourable friend for her strong leadership and in rising to this challenge. As others have shown, they also, too, in positions of leadership, have risen to the challenge. I'm only sorry that others in such positions have fallen well short. Can I ask her, in the conversation she is due to have with her allies, as she's quite right to do, she may raise with the German government the issue of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that they are engaged with the Russians, which will cut revenues from Ukraine and Eastern Europe and give Russia an unparalleled ability to bully those countries in the future. If Russia is, as we now believe, a rogue state, could she please try and persuade our allies in Europe and elsewhere not to treat with them and make them better off?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and can I say to him that I think one of the things that we will be discussing with our allies is how we can ensure that the robust message about the act that has taken place on UK soil is consistently given and continues to be given by all our allies. As regards Nord Stream 2, this is a matter that is regularly discussed at the European Union Council, as my right honourable friend would, I suspect, imagine.
Yvette Cooper.
Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Her conclusion about the culpability of the Russian state is an immensely serious one, and that, in addition to their breaches of international law, of the use of chemical weapons, but also their continued disregard for the rule of law and for human rights, must be met with unequivocal condemnation. I welcome both the measures she's taken to downgrade the intelligence capability that the Russian state has, but also, in particular, the work that I understand has started with the United Nations. It is important to expose Russia and what they are doing within the United Nations and to build the broadest possible support against them. Can she say a bit more about what she is doing on that front?
Can I also thank the Right Honourable Lady for the strength of the statement that she has just made, which I know is representative of many of her Right Honourable and Honourable friends on the backbenches opposite. We are taking this matter to the United Nations. My Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has already spoken to the UN Secretary-General about this issue. It will be part of an open discussion that is taking place tomorrow. That is the start of a process of looking at this issue. As I say, but as I indicated in response to my Right Honourable and learned friend, Member for Rushcliffe, this is not just about the incident that has taken place here in the United Kingdom. It is about this use of chemical weapons, this illegal use of chemical weapons that has taken place, and the role of the Russian state in the development of chemical weapons contrary to international law.
Julian Lewis. Mr. Speaker, no reasonable person can possibly doubt that the Russian government has behaved with arrogance, with inhumanity and with contempt, not least in failing to respond to the Prime Minister's deadline, which it surely would have done if it had known it was innocent of this charge. In welcoming the Prime Minister's expulsion of 23 diplomats who are really intelligence agencies, will I ask her to make it clear that any retaliation in kind by the Russian government will be met by further expulsions, possibly including even the ambassador, who spends so much time coming to talk to us in this place, bemoaning the poor state of Anglo-Russian relations. And will she accept that Russia traditionally respects strength and despises weakness, and that the time has come to recognise that 2% of GDP is not enough to spend on defence when we are reverting to the sort of adversarial relationship when we used to spend a much higher proportion of GDP in ensuring that this country was well defended.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his remarks? As I said in my statement, in response to his first point, there are other measures we stand ready to deploy at any time should we face further Russian provocation. On the other point that he made, of course, as we have been looking through our national security capability review and our modernising defence programme review, what we are doing is ensuring that for the variety and diversity of threats that this country faces, we have the resources and the capabilities available to deal with those threats. But of course, as those threats diversify, not all of them will be responded to by what is conventionally normally considered to be defence.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Can I say that I and my party fully support the Prime Minister's statement? Can I ask, what is her response to the brave leader of the opposition in Russia, Alexei Navalny, who is not allowed to stand in the presidential election, who has said that the most effective action the British government can take is to use its legal powers, such as the unexplained wealth orders, against named individuals who are critical to the Putin operation. And she names in particular Mr. Alisher Usmanov, who has substantial property and sporting interests, and the first Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Igor Shivalov, who, amongst other things, owns a £14 million flat overlooking the Ministry of Defence. Will she act?
Well, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for the support that he has given to the actions being taken by the government. Can I also say to him, as I did in my statement, that we do, of course, look at issues around corrupt elites, we look at issues around criminal finances, we look at using the tools and capabilities that are at our disposal. The National Crime Agency is continuing on that work.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for her impressive leadership in this matter. I associate myself, actually, unusually with the leader of the Liberal Democrats in calling for more use of unexplained wealth orders. But could I also ask her if she will use the tools at her disposal to expose the wealth of the Putin family. $300 billion or more has been stolen from the Russian people by that man. We should expose him for what he is and not be a useful idiot hiding behind legalism of his crimes.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his contribution and suggestion? Can I also say on the unexplained wealth orders, of course, those are tools that we do use, but consultations. Obviously, Russia is a member of that Security Council. But I think it's important that we continue to use the international organisations that are available to us. The United Nations is a protector of the international rules-based order. That's what it should be, and we will be continuing to press for a robust international response.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell. It's clear that almost unanimously across the House there is support for my right honourable friend's proportionate and right response to this crisis. In particular, she's absolutely right to use the mechanisms of the United Nations to make clear to everyone what has happened in this case. And will she also bear in mind that in Syria, Russia has either indirectly or directly authorised and used chemical weapons? And may I also thank her for what she has said about the Magnitsky Amendment, which many of us across the House have been working for some time now. I hope that she will give consideration for implementing the full Magnitsky Amendment as it has been implemented in America and in Canada.
Can I first of all say to my right honourable friend, and it picks up a point that was actually made from the previous question, that this isn't simply one act we see from Russia. This is a pattern of actions by Russia where they are undertaking in a variety of ways different actions. Of course, what we see them doing in Syria, what we've seen them doing by the illegal annexation of Crimea and their activities in the Donbass. We also see their use of propaganda, their attempt to interfere in elections across the continent of Europe. These are all the actions that the Russian state is getting involved in. And in response to the second point, we will bring forward a government amendment to reflect the Magnitsky considerations and to ensure that we have got the strongest possible means to deal with these issues.
Sammy Wilson.
We welcome the decisive action which has been taken by the Prime Minister today, and it sits in contrast with the policy of appeasement that we have heard from the front bench of the Labour Party. And I am sure that the people of the United Kingdom are pleased that it is the Prime Minister who is standing behind that dispatch box today, defending the rule of law and the citizens of this country. However, she has told us that she has spoken to our allies over the last couple of days. Perhaps she could tell us, apart from words of support, what actions have they committed to ensure that, first of all, a message is sent out about this action and actions in the future?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks and for the support of the DUP for the action that the government is taking on this matter? And can I say to him that in relation to the actions to be taken by international allies, of course they were waiting for us to announce the various actions that we were taking, the decision taken by the National Security Council this morning, but we will be holding further discussions with our allies about the way in which they can support what we are doing by actions themselves.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entirely agree with the approach adopted by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in how she's responded to this outrageous attack. She agreed with me that the difficulty we face is not so much in getting the concurrence of our allies in agreeing on the nature of the outrage, but how we are going to craft a sustained strategy so that those of us who believe in the rules-based international system can apply the necessary leverage and persuasion on Russia to conform to it. And that the very serious risk that we run is that if we don't succeed in doing this, the level of violence that Russia is going to exercise with impunity against other states and us will simply increase. And that this is something which our allies in particular must have regard to if we are going to make any progress.
My right honourable and learned friend is absolutely correct that this is an issue which we need to address in that wider sense, because it is about the way in which the Russian state is acting, it believes, with impunity in a whole variety of ways, the way in which it is flouting the international rules-based order. We must come together as allies to ensure that we are supporting that international rules-based order and that we have not not just a collective agreement, but a collective approach which ensures that we can challenge what Russia is doing. But he's also right. One of the points I think we should be making to our allies is that this may have happened in the United Kingdom, but actually it is something that could be happening in any of these states.
Hilary Benn.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I join others in welcoming the measures that the Prime Minister has announced today. As Russia has chosen to act against us in such an outrageous way, we have to demonstrate our determination to defend ourselves. Given that Russia's usual response is to deny all responsibility for such actions, as well as seeking the assistance of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in identifying the sample, does she intend, as any member state is entitled to do, to ask for that organisation to carry out an investigation, including an inspection of any facilities or locations in Russia where this nerve agent, in all probability, was produced?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that we will be talking to the OPCW about a number of ways in which not just the sample of the nerve agent used here in the United Kingdom can be independently verified, but other actions that the OPCW might be able to take.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
May I welcome the decision of the government to refer the patiently and carefully acquired evidence of this grotesque attack to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Is it her intention that their findings should be referred both to the Russians, to the United Nations and to ourselves? And will she consider, in the light of that finding, go further on unexplained wealth orders and other financial sanctions against Russia if necessary?
Can I say to my right honourable friend that, of course, we are asking the OPCW to independently verify this so that it can be clear to everyone the nature of this nerve agent. Can I also say to him that, as I've said earlier in response to the unexplained wealth orders, these are things which we do operate, we do use, and we have introduced, but we will always ensure that they are done on evidence and, obviously, we operate according to the rule of law.
Margaret Hodge.
Can I welcome the Prime Minister's clear statement and her condemnation of the Russians and the action she's taken? And can I in particular welcome the fact that she is adopting the Magnitsky Amendment now from the government? But can I say to her, too much money is being laundered out of Russia and finding its way into the British system. And there are two things she could do pretty quickly which would help to tackle that. In the first place, she could bring forward the public register of ownership of properties, which was promised by her predecessor in 2015 and has been delayed by this government. And in the second place, she could increase transparency in our corporate structures so we would know who forms companies here, where the money comes from, and deal with it if it's illicit money brought in by unsavoury people.
Can I say to the right honourable lady, in relation to the issue that she's raised about the transparency in relation to property ownership, that is something that I have discussed with the Business Secretary. We haven't been delaying that. We do need to ensure that we get that right when we introduce it, but we have been discussing the timing for introducing that, because we do want to ensure we've got all the tools in our locker that we can use and can help us in this in the endeavour that we're engaged in.
Nicky Morgan.
I want to absolutely 100% support the Prime Minister's statement and the actions that she is taking. And to follow up just from the last question, I want to particularly pick up on the Prime Minister's statement that there is no place for serious criminals and corrupt elites or their money in our country. There are amendments which I'm sure Parliament will support, but will the Prime Minister also bear in mind that the select committees could have a real role here in teasing out information, what is going on, to tackle dirty money in this country, whether in the City of London or elsewhere, to bring evidence to the House that could shape amendments and actions the government could then take?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for her suggestion? Can I say that I recognise the role that select committees can play. I suspect my right honourable friend has just set up a stream of work for her own Treasury Select Committee to undertake.
Bradshaw.
Can I assure the Prime Minister that most of us on these benches fully support the measures that she has announced today? and indeed some of us think they could have come a bit sooner. On the wider issue of Putin's hybrid warfare against our country, will she task the intelligence and security services to investigate Putin's influencing operations in our universities, in our think tanks, in our financial institutions and in our political parties?
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he raises an important issue about the propaganda activities that are being undertaken by the Russian state, and I will certainly look at the suggestion that he's made.
Mr. Simon Hoare.
Mr. Speaker, we should all be thanking God today that it's my right honourable friend in her place and not the so-called alternative. Absolutely right. I'm not expecting my right honourable friend to comment on the detail, but this morning, residents in my constituency, Hyde Road in Gillingham, saw the Metropolitan Police and the Army in place, the street in lockdown, removing vehicles and items linked to the Salisbury incident. I'm not expecting my right honourable friend to give a running commentary on current operations, but could she confirm two things? First, that she and the government and the security services are doing all that they can to keep my constituents safe, and can she arrange for somebody to provide a briefing to me as the Member of Parliament as to precisely what's happening?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I'm very happy to do that. As he will be aware, the police investigation does continue, and we cannot say where that investigation is going to take the police in terms of their further inquiries, but I will ensure that he is provided with a briefing as the Member of Parliament.
Ms. Bryant.
I completely support everything that the Prime Minister has said today. The truth is that under Putin, the Russian Federation has managed to combine all the worst facets of communism and all the worst facets of rampant capitalism, all wrapped up inside a national security state, which keeps its people poor and kills his political opponents. Can I just ask about the Russian ambassador? Because since he arrived here 7 years ago, Alexander Yakovenko, he has repeatedly lied to parliamentarians. He has tried to get the Speaker to stop debates on Russia happening in this House. He has tried to interfere in the internal elections of this House. And surely to God, it is time we now told him that we will order our affairs in this country, not him, and he can go home.
Well, just to say to the right honourable gentleman, he's absolutely right. We will order our affairs in this country, and we will not be told what to do by a Russian ambassador. And I fully expect the House authorities to ensure that it is not possible for an external party such as that to interfere in elections in this House. And can I also say that it's a brave man who tries to tell the Speaker of the House of Commons what to do and to stand anything down.
I must say, for the avoidance of doubt, he got absolutely nowhere with me. You can be sure about that. Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, it is noticeable that the length and breadth of this place has completely supported not just the wise words and the leadership of the Prime Minister, but also her firm actions, with a notable exception of the front bench of the opposition. And that is a shameful moment. But, Mr. Speaker, further to the question asked by the Honourable Member for Exeter, democracy is a fundamental British value, and there have been long-held concerns that Russia has been seeking to undermine it and interfere in it. If those concerns now turn to evidence, will she take equally robust action against Russia to ensure that our great British democracy continues to be protected?
Well, I'm very happy to give the assurance to my right honourable friend of the action that we take. We recognise that the first duty of government is to safeguard the nation, and we treat security and integrity of our democratic processes, as of everything else in this country, very seriously. In terms of disinformation that is used by the Kremlin, we know that they persistently use this to destabilise perceived enemies, and managing this is a long-term priority for the UK. We'll continue to work not just as the UK, but to work with our international partners on efforts to counter this.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Alongside many colleagues in this House, I speak on behalf of my party in calling for a robust and immediate response. Sources inform us that Russia is the UK's biggest weapons-grade nuclear substances export market. This is despite several attempts at a moratorium on depleted uranium by the European Parliament and the United Nations. Will the Prime Minister confirm whether the UK is still exporting nuclear substances to Russia? And if so, surely this should be among the very first sanctions imposed.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for the remarks that she's made and for the support that she has given from her party for the actions that the government is taking. What we have been talking about today, of course, is the use of a nerve agent, of a chemical weapon on UK soil, and the blatant flouting of the international rules-based order and the legal structure around that use of chemical weapons by the Russian state.
John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, when I served as Security Minister and my Right Honourable Friend was Home Secretary, I became aware both of her outstanding determination and dedication and of the commitment and expertise of our security services and the police that deal with counter-terrorism. She knows, as the House knows, that that is led for the Metropolitan Police. But of course this event happened in Salisbury and could have happened in Berkshire or Lincolnshire. Will she ask the Home Secretary look at whether our local police forces are, given the dynamic nature of these threats, equipped and informed adequately to deal with them in the first instance?
Prime Minister.
As a former Security Minister, of course, my right honourable friend has a particular understanding of these issues. Can I say to him that, of course, the ability to bring in the capabilities of the counter-terrorism police, who of course don't just operate in the Metropolitan Police, as he knows, but have regional bases around the country as well, is part of the layered structure that we have in relation to police forces. But I'm sure my right honourable friend will be making sure that the police look at the immediate response that they had to this incident to ensure that we certainly don't want to see an incident of this type happening again on United Kingdom soil. And that's why we're giving a very clear message to the Russian state. But we do want to ensure that all our police forces are aware of threats that they may face.
Mike Gapes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's words were appropriate, measured and correct, and she has my full support. She mentioned dirty money from Russia. Can she look again at the role of the tax havens internationally, including those in British overseas territories and Crown dependencies?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks. Can I say to him that, as he knows, we have been taking a number of measures in relation to financial activities in the British overseas territories and dependencies, and we continue to press on those. And of course, we have enhanced our ability to deal with these issues here in relation to economic crime through the formation of the National Economic Crime Centre, which I'm pleased to say, obviously having formed the National Crime Agency, we have now set up that National Economic Crime Centre as part of the NCA, which brings a number of capabilities together to deal with these issues.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents of Harlow will strongly, I think, be reassured by the way you are guarding the nation's security. Could I ask my honourable friend to condemn the remarks of President Putin, who attacked Jews and other nations for the meddling in the United States elections? And could I ask her, given that she's also said about possible rogue use of these chemical weapons, what is the prospect of such chemical weapons ending up in the hand of extreme Islamists?
Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I also condemn the remarks that he has referred to that were made in relation to certain communities in the United States. Can I say to my honourable friend, in relation to the second part of his question, what we are talking about here is a nerve agent that was developed as part of a chemical weapons programme by the Russian state. And I think that will give him a clear message in relation to this.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I fully support what the Prime Minister said in the statements and also for the action she outlined today? Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister this? I have some concerns about whether we have in place a proper strategy to combat chemical weapons attacks against this country, and particularly these small-tail attacks. And it's joined up with both security services, governments and the armed forces. Could the Prime Minister give me some reassurance or tell me whether actually work is continuing to improve that?
Yes, well, we do have, obviously this is an issue that we do look at, and we do have a strategy in place, but we will of course ensure, given what has happened, we will review that, we will look again to make sure that we have the best possible opportunity to ensure that this cannot happen again.
Mr. Crispin Blunt. Whilst welcoming the Prime Minister's statement, as almost everyone else has, can I join with the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield about the importance of the international rule of law, and say that this is a very important moment of decision for China to decide which side she is going to sit on in this arrangement. And can I urge my right honourable friend to make sure we take the most energetic steps to ensure that China stands with the rest of the civilised world on the side of law and responsibility.
Thank my honourable friend for raising this issue in this way. We want to see the maximum possible adherence to the international rules-based order across the whole world. In different contexts, this is a matter that I raised when I was in China recently.
This is an extremely important parliamentary occasion, and I think it's understandable that very large numbers of members should want to question the Prime Minister. Can I very politely suggest to colleagues that they should seek to ensure that their questions are as succinct as the Prime Minister's replies have been, and that way we might get through a very great many more quickly than we otherwise would. Chris Leslie.
Support to the measures the Prime Minister has announced and the condemnation of what is increasingly looking like a rogue state. On this question of the integrity of the United Nations Security Council, we must now begin to talk about reform. Russia cannot be allowed to simply sit pretty, thumbing its nose at the rest of the world community and feeling it is immune from the rule of law internationally. Will she initiate that sort of reform discussion with the General Secretary?
And I once again thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for the remarks he's made today and the support he's given to the government as he did on Monday. In relation to the question, we do talk to the United Nations about reform of the United Nations in a whole variety of ways. Of course, any decision, the catch-22, if you like, is that any decision that might be taken in the Security Council to reform it, of course, could be subject to a veto by Russia, who are sitting there. But the point has been raised not just by the Right Honourable Gentleman, but by others, and this is something that we will look at.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has underlined to the House that the Russian state has either been utterly reckless at best or directly complicit at worst in the deployment of a harmful substance on our soil. Can I ask her, in the statement, she said that she would be taking new measures to harden our defences against hostile state activity. With that in mind, will she ensure that appropriate balance is provided between counter-terrorism and counter-espionage to ensure that our excellent security and intelligence agencies are appropriately focused to combat and directly disrupt those who would cause harm in our country?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, who also as a former security minister has a particular knowledge and understanding of these issues, that I entirely take the point that he has made, and we do indeed we do constantly ensure that the balance is right between counter-terrorism and counter-espionage, and we will of course continue to ensure that that balance is maintained properly.
Pat McFadden.
Thank you. Responding with strength and resolve when your country is under threat is an essential component of political leadership. There is a Labour tradition that understands that, and it has been understood by Prime Ministers of all parties who have stood at that dispatch box. That means when chemical weapons are used, we need more than words but deeds. And can I ask the Prime Minister then what more she can do to enhance our solidarity with our allies, particularly at a time when there are nationalist forces trying to drive wedges between democratic countries, some of those forces backed and supported by the Russians themselves?
Can I first of all say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that he is, of course, absolutely right, that there is a strong tradition in the Labour Party of recognising the importance of acting in the national interest and acting when our national security is under threat. And we have seen that from governments. We've seen that from governments of all complexions over the years. In relation to the point about the international activity and the deeds that we need to take, it is right. We will be continuing to talk. We have been speaking to our allies even before this event took place about the ways in which we could deal and address some of the activities and actions that Russia is taking across the continent of Europe and elsewhere. But we will, of course, redouble those efforts now.
John Whittingdale. Does my right friend agree that one of the best assets we have against Russian disinformation and propaganda is the BBC World Service? Will she look at ways in which we can extend the reach of the World Service, perhaps by incorporating world television? And does she also agree that we need to be very careful not to give any pretext, however unjustified, for the Russians to take action against BBC and other free media outlets?
I would hope that the Russian state would be prepared to accept the importance of free media. Sadly, from one or two things that we heard last night, that may not continue. That may not be the case. But my right honourable friend is right that the broadcasting of the BBC, of the World Service, is an important element of the reach that the United Kingdom can have, but it's an important part of actually helping those people who believe in democracy and the rule of law and free speech and expression to have an outlet which is doing just that.
Alison Thewlis.
Mr Speaker, I was glad to hear that the Prime Minister mentioned the sanctions and anti-money laundering bill, and I welcome the commitment to the Magnitsky Amendment. But she will understand that many opaque SLPs and LLPs are engaged in money laundering from Russia via Azerbaijan, Georgia and the Ukraine through this country. Will she speak to Cabinet colleagues and also look at bringing forward amendments to the sanctions and anti-money laundering bill to tackle these corrupt elites, as she put it, because money laundering is happening via Companies House at the moment?
I think we got the thrust of it.
I say to the Honourable Lady that the question of money laundering is one that we do take very seriously. We have been working for some time now, both with law enforcement but also with the financial sector, on ways in which we can improve the action that we're taking against money laundering. And this is one of the things that I expect the National Economic Crime Centre to be looking at very closely.
Mr Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I strongly welcome the action that my right honourable friend has announced today. One way that Russia seeks to extend its influence in Europe is by building relationships of energy dependence. Is my right honourable friend aware that recently Britain has started to receive shipments of liquefied natural gas, but does she agree with me that Britain shouldn't provide a market for Russian gas? If we do need to bring in extra LNG imports, then we have allies like Qatar, Malaysia, Australia, who are more than willing to sell it to us.
Can I reassure my right honourable friend that when we are looking to our gas supplies, we are indeed looking to other countries?
Varen Coker.
Can I say to the Prime Minister, I am another one who supports the statement that she's made today as a strong advocate for the defence and security of our country. Can I also draw attention to something I don't want to get lost, what the Prime Minister said, which was while our response must be robust, it must also remain true to our values. And as such, would the Prime Minister perhaps say a little bit about something that I think she's done, which is not to say that we're going to ban Russia today, which actually I think is a strong point to make. This country believes in a free media. We're not frightened of it. We'll hear opinions that are against us, but we also believe in the rule of law and democracy.
Right honourable gentleman is right. We do believe in the rule of law and democracy, and we do believe in free media. Of course, the question of the status of Russia today in broadcasting in the United Kingdom is not a matter for the government. It is a matter for the independent Ofcom to consider.
Richard Graham.
The Prime Minister was absolutely right to say that our argument is not with the Russian people, but with the Russian state that has sponsored murder on our streets. Today we've heard absolute solidarity from across the Western world and most political parties. But what statement of support has my right honourable friend received from the one political party which gives unequivocal 100% backing for the leader of the opposition, the Communist Party of Great Britain?
I have to say to my honourable friend, I don't believe I have received any such statement from the Communist Party of Great Britain, although I did notice I did notice that I think a matter of 1 or 2 weeks ago, they did say that they weren't going to be standing candidates against where the Labour Party was standing, and that they now felt more comfortable in working with the Labour Party.
Sir Edward Davey. Strongly welcome the Prime Minister's statement, but urge her to go further and, like others, use energy policy as a new way of tackling this Russian threat. While there are significant British energy interests in Russia, and we all acknowledge that, can she confirm that Putin's military and intelligence assets are primarily funded by the sale of Russian fossil fuels? Can I therefore commend her to look at the EU's energy security strategy, which is largely written in London and is reducing Europe's dependency on Russian fossil fuels?
The point that the right honourable gentleman makes, which has been made by other members across the House, is about the extent to which Russia uses its energy as a means to influence and to have an impact on those countries that are in receipt of it, and also the finances that it provides from what is an important one. And I can assure him that as we will be continuing to discuss with the European Union not just our energy security, but that wider energy security issue.
Many members of this and the other House are members of multilateral parliamentary organisations. Like the Council of Europe and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, would my right honourable friend agree that a way we can help get behind her leadership and the government's position on this is to, when we attend events, to get the message across, to explain the policies of this government, to explain what has happened and why our allies should be supporting us?
I say to my right honourable friend, I think he has raised an extremely valuable point, and I welcome that suggestion and would encourage him and others
to have a fundamental reassessment of our defence spending, in collaboration preferably with our allies, but alone if not?
Can I say to my honourable friend, as he will know, we are one of the limited number of countries within NATO that maintains our commitment to spending 2% of our GDP on defence. We do have, as I'm sure he's aware, the modernising defence programme that is being undertaken at the moment alongside the National Security Capability Review. It is important that we are able to deal with the variety of threats that we face. But I will say to my honourable friend, as I have to other members of this House, that in looking at how we deal with those threats, not all of them will be dealt with in a way that would conventionally be considered as a matter for the Ministry of Defence.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly said that the attacks in Britain have been part of an ongoing contempt of Britain, contempt of the rule of law, and contempt of our values. But it has also been a contempt of our alliances, both political and military. In moving forward, will the Prime Minister work with those political and military alliances so that together we have a root and branch removal of Russian interference in our political, our education and our financial institutions? Let this be a marker. No more. Now they will fear what we will do to hit back on the interference they have shown us.
Thank you, and I thank the Honourable Lady for the commitment that she has shown as a parliamentarian to the alliance we have through NATO, which is very important to us, is the bedrock of European defence, and I will certainly say that we will continue to work through those alliances to ensure that we are sending a very clear message that this is not acceptable.
Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister on her decisive and vigorous action in response to what was, after all, an attack on the United Kingdom. In some ways, it had flashes of the Iron Lady about it. But it was also in stark contrast to the attitude of the Leader of the Opposition, who simply could not bring himself to condemn Russia for this outrageous act. He simply couldn't do it. And is that not because he remains at heart what he has always been, a CND badge-wearing apologist for the Russian state?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I think that people will take their own conclusions from what they have heard today. But I can also say to my honourable friend that I'm sure he, as I do, take a great reassurance from the positive messages of support that have come from the Labour backbenches.
Phil Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, our way of life in this country and in the West is based on democracy, human rights and the rule of law, and should be defended.
Outrageous. Held opinions have been expressed. Everybody can consult the record, and I understand that there is an intensity of feeling, but the honourable gentleman member for Sedgefield must have his question heard, and then the answer will be heard. Phil Wilson.
Our way of life in this country and in the West is based on human rights, democracy and the rule of law, and should be defended. And that's why the Prime Minister is right to bring forward these sanctions against the state, that a state that doesn't actually believe in those principles. Can the Prime Minister give a commitment to come back to the House if she feels the need for further consideration of sanctions should be made?
The honourable gentleman has raised an important point. I did say in my statement that we had further measures that we might wish to deploy if we were subject to further Russian provocation. And of course, if we choose to do so, I will come back to this House.
Sir Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend accept that the actions of the Russian Federation are totally incompatible with membership of the Council of Europe, which believes in democracy, human rights and the rule of law? Will my right honourable friend therefore ensure that we can expel Russia from the Council of Europe as a reprisal, because its continuing membership of the Council of Europe seems to fly in the face of our commitment to those important values?
My honourable friend has raised an important point. Can I simply say to him, I don't think it's within the hands only of the United Kingdom to expel Russia from the Council of Europe, but as he will have heard our right honourable friend, the member for Newbury, making the point that members of this House who are members of such multilateral groupings should, I think, be making every effort to make the point about the illegitimate activity that has been undertaken by Russia.
Emma Reynolds.
Speaker, I welcome very much the Prime Minister's statement today and the measures that she has announced, which will only be strengthened if our allies take similar action. Can she say more about NATO and whether she will be bringing together NATO heads of state and government to discuss a coordinated response?
As I think I said earlier in a response, I believe the NATO Council will be meeting tomorrow to discuss this particular issue, and I will be talking to a number of allies who are within NATO about coordination of the response. As I also said earlier in response to a previous question, of course they have been waiting to hear for the details of our response, which I brought first to Parliament.
Seeley.
Speaker, the Prime Minister is clearly aware that the Kremlin is using a very full spectrum of tools in what it considers to be its new generation warfare against the West. Assassination is one element of that. Is the Prime Minister aware of the important work which was done in the 70s and 80s by the Senate Intelligence Committee in the United States to methodically expose Russian or Kremlin subversion, espionage and disinformation? And in that era, that was called active measures, activna meropриятия. Will she consider something similar for this country now? Because the light of truth and shining that light on truth on Russian subversion today, however one calls it, is a critical part of defending democracy and undermining Russian subversion. Thank you.
Yes. Well, can I say to my honourable friend that I wasn't aware of the details of the work of the Senate committee that he has referred to, but it is the case that this is a government which is not afraid to call out Russian actions in public when we see those actions taking place. But I take the point that he's making about a more detailed and forensic look at the activities of the Russian state, and I will certainly consider that.
Penny Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In supporting the Prime Minister's strategy, can I remind her, though, that during the Putin years he has become emboldened, sometimes because our allies, the Europeans and internationally, have not always been prepared to face down that kind of aggression relative to their commercial interests. If we are going to stay the course, can you remind our allies they are as much a threat as we have been with this act of state terror?
The honourable gentleman makes a very important point. This may have happened on UK soil today. It could have happened in any one of a number of countries, and I think it's important. And other countries are themselves seeing other actions being taken by Russia, such as attempts to interfere in elections and propaganda and disinformation campaigns. And it's important that we do, as far as possible, work together.
Dame Gerald Gillen.
I also add my support to the Prime Minister for the cool, calm, collected and correct way she has responded to a very serious threat to this country. Would she be pleased to know that both the First Minister of Wales and the First Minister in Scotland have both tweeted their support for the Prime Minister and the action she has taken? And will she undertake to always keep the devolved administrations fully informed of what is happening?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for letting me know of the tweets that have been put out by the First Ministers in Scotland and in Wales. I'm pleased to say I will be meeting both of those First Ministers later this afternoon, as we both for bilaterals and in the JMC plenary meeting, and I certainly undertake, we have been keeping the devolved administrations aware of what we were doing, and I certainly undertake to continue to do that.
David Hanson.
The Prime Minister has made the right call on the facts before her today, and her judgment is correct in this matter. Could she, though, also look at the issue of transport of materials and assets from other countries? Because material will very often not go direct from Moscow to London. And will she ensure that our European partners and NATO partners take the same action if evidence leads to that conclusion?
That is an important point that has been raised. We will be looking at the issue of movement of materials and indeed, as I indicated in my statement, looking at further action we can be taking in relation not just to movement of materials but of people as well. And this is something that we would, of course, be discussing with our allies.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has such widespread support because she has learnt the lesson of history that tyrants must be stood up to. And can I encourage her to impose a freeze on assets so that people don't have the opportunity of taking them out of the country in the short term, and to boost the military resources in Estonia, where we have 800 troops already, to show very tangibly that we will support our friends and allies who may also be at risk from Russia?
I thank my honourable friend for his remarks. As I said in my statement, we will freeze Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life or property of UK nationals or residents. I was pleased to be able to visit the troops that we had in Estonia last September. We are, of course, there with other allies, and I was pleased that at the Anglo-French summit that we held in January, President Macron committed to a continuing contingent of French troops joining our troops in Estonia. It is an important symbol that we collectively have of our determination to protect the West against Russia.
Sarah Jones.
Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Given the inevitable focus over recent years on ISIS and the terrorism that we've seen at home, is the Prime Minister content that across government, the Home Office, the security services and other agencies, we have enough specific Russian expertise as well as enough resource, or do we need to increase that expertise given this event and many others that show that the Russian government are intent on undermining our democracy?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right that in recent years there has been an appropriate and correct focus on counter-terrorism, but that doesn't mean that we haven't been looking at hostile state activity and haven't been looking at counter-espionage measures, because we indeed have. We keep these in balance as we go forward, as we assess the threats that we're facing, and will continue to do so.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, ever since Russian troops first entered Ukraine, friends from many different countries have told me how false news stories emanating from Russian sources